The sun bled low over the Gila Valley, turning cactus spines into spears of fire. Elias Harper's boots dragged through the sand, each breath a rasp in the dying heat. Behind him, the thunder of hooves drew closer. Diego Salazar's band, 13, ruthless men hunting one broken drifter. His Winchester weighed heavy in his hands, 12 bullets. No more. He braced for the last stand at a dry waterhole, ready to trade his life dearly. Then, from the yucca shadows, 8 painted Apache warriors rose, bows taut and carbines leveled. For the first time in weeks, Elias wasn't alone. The battle left the valley steeped in smoke and echoes. When the last gunshot faded into the cliffs, the desert air carried only the smell of powder and sweat. Elias Harper staggered, not quite believing he still breathed. Beyond the scarred ground, the Gila River shimmered faintly, its rare waters winding through a canyon of red stone and towering cactus. The land itself felt both merciless and alive, sunlight striking sharp across ridges, wind dragging grit over skin. The cry of a hawk cutting through silence. He had known many places in his years of drifting westward, but none like this. The Gila was a valley of contrast, bone-dry earth yet lined with secret pools. Thorn brush, hiding blooms that burst red and yellow. For the Apache, who called it home. It was sacred, for men like Elias. It was unforgiving. They led him into camp with cautious eyes, weapons never far from reach. The Apache settlement rested along a bend of the river, where cottonwoods offered shade and the air carried a faint sweetness of mesquite smoke. Lodges of hide and stone blended with the earth itself, so that from a distance the camp looked born of the desert. Children paused their games to stare at him, while women carried water jars with quiet dignity. At the camp's heart stood Dasan, the elder. His hair was silver, his face etched with seasons of sun and loss. In his gaze flickered both sorrow and resolve, as though he bore not only his people's burdens, but the memory of centuries. Elias sensed at once the weight of judgment there. He was not welcomed as kin, but neither dismissed as enemy. Bezil, the war leader who had guided the warriors, carried himself like the edge of a drawn blade, sharp, proud, unyielding. It was clear the young fighters looked to him with reverence. His suspicion toward Elias was plain. Every glance measured whether the drifter was worth the blood spent in saving him. And then there was Ahyoka. She did not step forward yet, but Elias noticed her at the edge of the firelight, tall, poised, with long black hair glinting where strands were bound in silver. Her eyes were deep and steady, watching without judgment, but never without thought. She was younger than he expected, barely past 20, but something in her bearing spoke of education and purpose. It struck Elias as odd that she seemed to belong to both this desert and some other world beyond it. As night spread its cold fingers over the valley, Elias sat by their fire, the weight of exhaustion pressing him down. For the first time in years, he did not sleep alone under an indifferent sky. Yet, in the hush of the camp, he understood a truth. Survival had brought him here, but destiny would decide if he could remain. Elias Harper awoke to the sound of drums. They were not the thunderous beats of war, but slow, deliberate, like a heart reminding itself to keep time. He sat up on the woven mat where they had laid him, the rawhide walls of the lodge glowing orange from firelight outside. The aches of yesterday's battle still gripped his limbs, but sharper than any wound was the question: why had they saved him? When he stepped out, the camp was gathered in a circle. The Apache warriors stood proud, their painted faces solemn in the flicker of flame. Women with braids hung heavy with beads watched silently, children clutching their skirts. At the center, Dasan raised a staff carved with symbols of clan and spirit. His voice, low and steady, rolled over the people like the current of the Gila River. Though Elias did not understand the words, the weight of them pressed into his chest. Beside Dasan stood Bijil, tall and tense, a hawk's gaze fixed on Elias, as though daring him to falter. Around them, the warriors who had fought beside him last night bore the same look, a blend of curiosity and suspicion. He could feel their question. Unspoken, was this stranger a brother, or a danger waiting to turn? Then Dasan spoke in halting English, words hard-shaped by a tongue not raised to them. You fought with my sons. You bled with them. The spirits saw. He paused. Staff, striking earth. You are not enemy. You are gift. Elias shifted uneasily. He had been called many things in his life: drifter, deserter, outlaw, but never gift. From behind the elder, a figure moved forward. She stepped into the circle with a calm that seemed to part the firelight. Ahioka. Her name rippled across the gathering as though it carried its own power. Elias's breath caught. She was dressed in a deerskin dress, worked with turquoise and quill, her hair flowing like black water over her shoulders. Silver flashed at her temples, where small clasps caught the fire's glow. But it was her eyes that held him dark. Intelligent, unwavering. They regarded him not as a man to fear nor to admire, but as one whose soul must be measured. Elias felt himself straightened under that gaze, as if stripped of pretense. Dasan extended his hand toward her. This is my daughter, Ahioka, he said. She will be your wife. The words struck Elias harder than any bullet. Murmurs rippled through the camp, some approving, others sharp with surprise. He froze, unsure if he had misheard. But the solemn faces told him it was no jest. His voice cracked, dry from disbelief. I didn't ask for Bidzil. Stepped forward like a storm breaking, his hand tight on the hilt of his knife. You dare refuse what is given. You think yourself above us. His words, though in Apache, carried a sting. Elias understood well enough. Ahioka raised her hand, silencing him without force. Her voice came clear, strong, touched with an accent, yet fluent. It is not refusal, she said, looking at Elias, but speaking to all. It is confusion. The white man does not know our ways. Her tone was not warm, nor hostile. It was exact. She was interpreting him as one might a text, giving no more than truth. Elias swallowed, meeting her eyes. For the first time, he sensed not just beauty, but authority. The quiet command of someone who carried her people's memory and future alike. Dasan's staff struck again. You saved my people from death. We give you life in return. You are bound now. Her hand is your tether. With it, you belong. The fire crackled in the silence that followed. Elias felt the weight of every eye upon him. Part of him longed to laugh at the absurdity who had lost everything, offered a wife by strangers. Yet another part, deeper and quieter, stirred with something he could not name. For years he had walked alone, chasing ghosts across deserts. Now, for reasons beyond his choosing, he was no longer untethered. When the gathering broke, Ahioka approached him. She moved with the grace of someone raised between two worlds, her steps light as desert sand, her bearing straight as any woman of Santa Fe's schools. She stopped within arm's reach, her gaze steady. You do not have to like this, she said softly, her English precise, tinged with Spanish, but you must respect it. My father has spoken. To refuse is to shame him. To accept is to protect more than yourself. Elias met her eyes, searching. And what of you? Did you choose this? Her expression shifted, a flicker of something unreadable. I choose my people, she said at last. That is all I have ever chosen. She turned, leaving him with words that felt both shield and blade. Elias stood watching the sway of her braid as she vanished into the dark, the fire painting her silhouette against the canyon walls. For the first time since arriving in the Gila, Elias realized the war he had stumbled into was not only of bullets and blood, it was a war of belonging, of survival. of hearts bound where they had no wish to be bound. And in the center of it stood a woman whose gaze he could not shake, whose fate was now entwined with his own. The days that followed settled like dust over the Gila Valley, slow, fine, and persistent. Elias Harper learned quickly that survival in this camp meant more than breathing. It meant listening, watching, and bending himself to a rhythm older than any cattle trail he had ever ridden. At dawn, smoke from the cooking fires curled upward, carrying the scent of roasted corn and mesquite. Elias woke to the murmurs of women grinding seeds, the laughter of children running barefoot over packed earth, the low murmur of men discussing the day's hunt. He felt at once foreign and tethered, as though the camp breathed around him, while he remained a stone lodged in its stream. Ahioka was his guide, not by choice, perhaps, but by decree. She approached their strange bond with a calm that unsettled him more than anger ever could. When he stumbled with the snares, she corrected his hands without softness. "Too tight," she said, pulling the rawhide cord until it sang. When he failed to spot the faint trace of water in dry riverbed cracks, she crouched low, fingertips brushing damp sand, eyes flicking up to him with a mix of disappointment and patience. "You must see with more than your eyes," she told him. "The desert hides what it does not want to give. If you do not respect that, you will die thirsty." Her words cut, but Elias endured them. He remembered Ohio's fields, green and generous, where water bubbled without asking. Here, every sip was a battle. He respected that, even if he resented being lectured like a child. One evening, after a long day tracking jackrabbits, Elias collapsed by the fire. His hands ached, his throat dry. But the sight of Ahioka preparing the meat struck him with quiet awe. She moved swiftly, blade flashing in firelight, her braid falling forward as she worked. No gesture was wasted. "You were not always here," Elias said finally, surprising himself with the sound of his own voice. "You've seen other places." She paused, glancing at him. "Santa Fe. The sisters taught me letters, Spanish, English, the ways of your people." Her tone carried no boast. It was fact, delivered as coolly as the desert night. "Then why come back?" Her hands slowed over the meat. "Because letters do not stop soldiers. Prayers do not keep land. Here, I am needed." Elias heard the unspoken layer her people had chosen her as their bridge, the one who could speak both tongues. She had not been given a choice. He felt a pang of kinship. He too had been driven by duty, not of his own making. First as a son, then as a soldier, and now as something else entirely. In the days that stretched into weeks, small exchanges accumulated. She taught him to taste the sweetness of cactus fruit and the bitterness of desert sage. He showed her how to mend a saddle strap with sturdy stitching, and she did not mock his clumsy fingers. They shared silence as often as words. And in those silences, Elias found himself studying her, the curve of her jaw, the firelight glinting off her earrings, the way her eyes sharpened when she measured the horizon. Once, while gathering mesquite pods, Elias asked without thinking, "Do you ever want more than this, a life without fear of soldiers?" Without hunger, her reply came soft but edged. "Wanting does not change the desert. You learn to live with what is given, or you de-wishing." It silenced him, but the words stayed. He realized she did not speak only of the desert. She spoke of their union, their people's survival, the endless struggle between wanting and enduring. As autumn deepened, the bond between them shifted. Not romance, not yet, but trust born of necessity. When Elias fell while climbing a ridge, it was Ahioka's hand that gripped his wrist, steady as stone. When a rattlesnake coiled near her path, it was Elias's rifle that shattered the silence, leaving its body twitching in dust. Each act was small, yet together they built a foundation stronger than words. One night, beneath a sky littered with stars, Elias confessed more than he intended. Back east. I had a family. Fever took them all. I left because there was nothing left to hold. Ahioka's eyes softened, the fire reflecting tears she did not shed. She reached for the leather pouch at her side, drawing out a small carved figure of a bird. This was my mother's. She sang to the fire before each hunt. When she died, I kept her voice here. She pressed it into his palm for a moment, then withdrew. We both carry ghosts. The silence after was not heavy, but shared, as though for a breath their sorrows aligned. As winter's edge crept into the valley, Elias realized something unsettling. He no longer felt like a stranger in the camp. Children no longer stared but waved when he passed. Warriors nodded, some grudging, some approving, and Ahioka, though her words remained sharp, no longer looked at him as an outsider. She looked at him as someone who had begun to belong. For Elias, who had drifted for years like tumbleweed across plains, the feeling was both comfort and terror. Comfort, because the weight of loneliness eased. Terror, because he knew nothing so fragile as belonging could last forever. And yet, when he saw Ahioka glance at him across the firelight, her expression unreadable but no longer distant, he felt a stirring, deep inside, a thought he dared not name. A hope as dangerous as it was necessary. The first warning came with the dust. A thin veil on the horizon. Too steady to be wind. Too broad to be buffalo. By midday, a scout galloped into camp, face tight with urgency. "Cousin, ever you," he shouted in Apache. The word, like a whip, cracked soldiers. Elias stood beside Bidziel as the news spread. Men gripped their weapons. Women clutched children. The air turned heavy with dread. Even before the rider finished, Elias knew who led them. He had heard the name whispered like a curse. Lieutenant Colonel Silas Whitmore, the scourge of the southern plains. A man who believed the only good Apache was one driven onto reservation land or buried beneath it. That evening, a council gathered around the fire. Dasan's staff marked the circle, his weathered face drawn with exhaustion. "The Bluecoats march," he said in Apache, voice low but firm. "If they find us, they will burn the lodges, scatter our children, chain our men." The circle broke into argument. Warriors demanded a strike, hit the soldiers in canyon passes, bleed them before they reached the valley. Elders urged retreat, to hide in the mountains as their ancestors had. Voices clashed, sparks flying into the night sky like angry spirits. Elias felt the weight of eyes on him. He was still a stranger, but he was also a man who had stood against enemies with them. They wanted to know what would he say. Before he could speak, Ahioka rose. The fire caught her face, shadows cutting along her cheekbones, her eyes sharp with resolve. "If we fight, we are crushed. If we flee, we are hunted. We need time. Time to prepare. Time to decide." Her gaze flicked to Elias. "He can give us that." Elias stiffened. "Me?" She stepped closer, addressing the council. "The soldiers believe him one of their kind. He will go to them, claim he was taken by us, claim he escaped. He will tell them lies that lead them astray." Bidziel spat into the dust. "Risky. If he fails, they return with more guns." Ahioka's jaw tightened. "If we do nothing, they return anyway." All eyes turned to Elias. He had been many things in his life: cowhand, deserter, survivor, but never a savior. The thought of walking willingly into Whitmore's hands made his stomach twist. Yet when he looked at Ahioka, he saw no fear, only certainty. And he remembered her words: to accept is to protect more than yourself. "I'll do it," he said, voice steady, though his insides churned. "But I'll need to look the part." So they made him into a ghost of a prisoner. Ahioka cut jagged lines into his shirt, stained the fabric with ash and dirt. She smeared red clay on his skin, leaving him bruised in appearance. With a knife, she nicked his hair unevenly, strands falling into the fire. Her hands, deft and unhesitating, left him ragged and believable. When she stepped back, her eyes lingered on him, softer than before. "Take this," she whispered, pressing a small leather pouch into his palm. "My mother's charm. For protection." Elias closed his fingers around it. The weight, oddly grounding. What if it doesn't work? Then at least you will not walk alone. The next morning, under a white cloth tied to a branch, Elias stumbled toward the advancing column. The clatter of hooves and jangle of sabers filled the air before the soldiers themselves came into view, dust rising like storm clouds. At their head rode Whitmore, tall in his saddle, his mustache waxed to cruel points, his eyes pale as winter sky. He raised a hand, halting his men as Elias collapsed before them. "Good God," one soldier muttered. "It's a white man." Whitmore dismounted, boots crunching gravel. He loomed over Elias, suspicion sharpening his features. "Name yourself." "Elias Harper," he croaked, forcing the tremor into his voice. "Prospector out of Santa Fe." He coughed, letting dust and weakness steal his breath. "They took me. Weeks. I barely escaped." Whitmore's gaze pierced him, cold and measuring. "Where's their camp?" Elias swallowed, choosing his lies with care. "In the cliffs east of the river, tunnels, caves, dozens of them. I slipped away when they drank mezcal." He lifted his head just enough to let desperation show. "Please, Colonel, don't go near the river. Too many. You'll be slaughtered," the men muttered, shifting uneasily. Fear was contagious, and Elias fed it with every rasp, every stagger. Whitmore studied him a long moment, then barked an order. "Give him water. Put him on a mule. We march east at dawn." Relief threatened to buckle Elias's knees. He had bought the Apache time, but he also knew Whitmore's suspicion was not fully eased. The colonel's eyes lingered on him, as though sensing the falsehood beneath his words. By nightfall, Elias slipped away under cover of darkness, returning to the valley with lungs burning and legs trembling. When he stumbled into camp, Ahioka was waiting. She did not smile, but her eyes glistened as she pressed the charm still clutched in his fist. "You returned," she whispered, but triumph soared quickly. Within days, scouts brought word Whitmore had doubled back, now with 70 men. He had seen through the ruse. The valley shook with fear. Warriors sharpened blades. Elders wailed prayers. Children clung to their mothers. In the council, fires glow. Despair pressed down, heavier than the desert night. The choice loomed: fight and perish, flee and scatter, or gamble on something unheard of, peace. And once again, it was Ahioka's voice that rose above the clamor. The council fire burned low, its embers glowing like scattered stars across the sand. Men argued in harsh bursts. Women murmured prayers, but over it all, the elder Dasan's silence carried weight. He sat unmoving, eyes shut, as if listening to voices older than any present. At last, he lifted his staff, and the clamor stilled. "We stand at the edge of fire," he said. "One path burns quickly, the other burns slow. But burn, we must." Into the hush, Ahioka rose. Her face shone with sweat, but her voice carried steady. "There is a third path," she said, turning toward Elias. "We ask for words, not blood. He will carry them." A ripple went through the circle. Bijil bristled, panned on his knife. "You would hand our lives to a drifter. He is no son of this valley." Ahioka's gaze cut to him, sharp as obsidian, and yet he stood with us, lied for us, risked his life, while others only argued. She turned back to Elias, her tone softer. "He is not Apache, but he is not enemy either. He can speak where we cannot." Elias felt every eye burn into him. His throat tightened. He had never been chosen for anything but exile. Yet, here was trust offered like a blade dangerous to take, more dangerous to refuse. Slowly, he nodded. I'll go, but only if I go as more than a mouthpiece. If I speak for myself as well. My life's tied to yours now. Ahioka's lips parted, the faintest curve hinting at relief. That night, beneath the cottonwoods, by the river, she sought him out. The moon turned her dress pale silver, her hair dark as the current. For a moment, neither spoke, only listened to water sliding over stone. You did not have to accept, she said at last. I didn't have to stay, Elias answered, but I did. Maybe that means something. She studied him, her eyes soft but searching. You are bound to me. Elias Harper, not by love, not yet but by survival. Do you resent that? He let out a breath, rough with honesty. I resented everything once. Losing my family, losing my land, wandering until I had nothing left. But here, his voice caught, here, I don't feel empty. For the first time. Ahioka's stern composure cracked. She stepped closer, her hand brushing the pouch she had given him, still tied at his neck. My mother's charm was meant to keep me safe. I gave it to you, and you came back. Perhaps the spirits listen. Their eyes met, and something unspoken bridged the space fragile, dangerous, but undeniable. Elias reached for her hand, calloused fingers trembling as they touched. She did not pull away. The next day, preparations began. Elias rehearsed words, tested phrases in both English and Spanish, while Ahioka guided his tongue. She was exacting, correcting his tone until each sentence rang with dignity. Do not beg, she warned. Speak as equal. Soldiers respect strength, not supplication. Meanwhile, the camp shifted. Warriors sharpened weapons not for attack but for defense. Elders gathered sacred bundles, ready to flee if talks failed. Children watched Elias with wide eyes, whispering, as though he were a spirit caught between worlds. On the morning of departure, Elias strapped his rifle across his back, though he knew he must not raise it. Ahioka approached, fastening a strip of white cloth to his arm. Her fingers lingered longer than necessary. Remember, she murmured, you carry more than yourself. You carry our last chance. Elias met her Gaza. And I carry you. Her breath caught, and for a heartbeat. The warrior's daughter seemed simply a woman, torn between duty and a stirring she could not name. Then she straightened, resolve returning like steel beneath silk. As Elias mounted the borrowed horse, the people gathered in silence. Some gave blessings, others muttered doubts. Only Ahioka stepped close enough for him to hear. Come back to me, she said. It was not a command, nor quite a plea, but something fiercer, a vow. With that, Elias rode toward Whitmore's camp, the horizon burning with sunrise. Behind him, the valley waited, fragile as glass, and before him loomed a gamble that could shatter or save them all. For 3 days, the talks dragged like a wounded animal. Elias stood between Whitmore's steel-eyed soldiers and the Apache delegation, his voice raw from translating demands and denials. Whitmore wanted surrender, submission, proof of victory. The Apache wanted land, breath, the right to live as they always had. Each word seemed to build a wall higher than the last. But Elias did not break. He spoke not as drifter or outcast, but as a man tethered to both worlds. He reminded Whitmore of treaties broken, of blood already spilled. He reminded the Apache that survival sometimes meant bending so that the roots remained. His words carried not eloquence, but grit, shaped by nights of dust and loss, by the faith in Ahioka's steady eyes. On the final evening, under a sun sinking red into the valley, Whitmore signed a fragile accord. The Apache would keep part of the Gila, their lodges and fields spared. In return, they swore not to raid beyond their borders. It was peace born of exhaustion, tenuous as thread, but peace nonetheless. When Elias returned to camp, Ahioka was waiting. The firelight touched her face, and for once she smiled. Not the careful mask of duty, but a smile that reached her eyes. "You came back," she whispered. "I promised," he answered simply. Months later, spring broke across the valley. Wildflowers pushed through cracks in the red earth, their colors stubborn against the dust. Ahioka cradled a newborn girl in her arms, swaddled in soft deerskin. Elias stood beside her, eyes damp as he brushed a finger across his daughter's cheek. Elena Harper, two worlds bound in one small body, breathing proof that love could grow even in the harshest soil. Around them, the camp sang, voices rising with drums. For the first time, Elias felt the valley was no longer a place of exile but of home. And when the wind swept through the cottonwoods, scattering petals, like prayers, Elias knew the Gila would remember this moment not for battles fought, but for the fragile bloom of hope planted in its dust. Thank you for walking beside Elias and Ahioka through the dust of the Gila Valley. Stories like this remind us that the Wild West was not only guns and battles, but also love, sacrifice, and fragile hope. If this journey moved you, please like, share, and subscribe so more voices can rise from history's silence. Each story we tell keeps the frontier alive, not as a place of endless war, but as a land where hearts still dared to hope. Join us, and let these stories continue to bloom across time.